Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex First Assault Online. Yes, that is a ridiculously long title. But anyway, this was developed by Neepel, I guess that's how you pronounce it. It's spelled like people, but with an N at the beginning. And it was published by Nexon, and it's been in a sort of, kind of, alpha, beta stage for a while. I pretty much think that anything that is charging you for microtransactions should no longer be considered in beta or alpha stages, but anyway. They're considering it an open beta stage right now, and as far as I can tell, that version was released in July of this year, but it was in early access before that. And while it is free to play now, back during its early access stage, it was, I believe, $5, so not really a high entry fee, but still an entry fee. And quite frankly, this thing is riding almost exclusively on its license, because it is one of the rather few Ghost in the Shell games to exist. Ghost in the Shell is obviously an extremely popular anime and manga series, and it's one of my favorites actually. And to see it get the Korean free-to-play FPS treatment is actually kind of insulting. You see, Korean FPSs are usually extremely derivative of the likes of Counter-Strike, and the free-to-play model that Korean games tend to adopt is one of pay-to-win rather than anything else, because apparently that's perfectly acceptable over there. Well, here's the thing, for the rest of the world it's not acceptable. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly how it is, both from a business model standpoint, as well as how it is actually as a game. Well, as far as presentation goes, it looks positively last gen, if you could even really call it that. The texture quality is really not very good at all, the modeling is okay but nothing special, animations are slightly stiff but generally serviceable, and it does have that sort of anime styling going on with it, as well as the rather cyberpunk aesthetic that Ghost in the Shell is known for, although it does take quite a few liberties with the actual designs of things. Although there is one thing that is actually rather interesting about the way they present this game, and that is that they actually have clips from the anime itself, Standalone Complex, in the actual game. Granted, they're basically nothing more than bits in the menus and in the character bios to give you some vague impression of what might be going on with those characters and what might be going on if you hop into the game itself. Thing is that it isn't really all that representative of what you're actually playing, obviously. So while it is kind of cool that they do have that in the game, unfortunately it really feels more like a cheap gimmick to just kind of slap the face of Ghost in the Shell fans more than anything else. Basically all it did for me is make me want to watch Standalone Complex again, which I do very highly recommend to you, by the way. But anyway, once you get past the actual visuals and their relatively low quality but decent aesthetics, you end up in the sound design where things can get rather messy. Sound effects are rather generic for the most part and end up just being average at best. The music is some pretty generic techno stuff that really doesn't fit in quite as well as you might think, and it's certainly no iconic Origa and Yoko Kanno soundtrack. Seriously though, the soundtrack to Standalone Complex is utterly fantastic. Its absence in First Assault Online is rather conspicuous, especially considering they did get the English voice cast for Standalone Complex to do voice work for their various characters in First Assault Online as well, so it's actually a bit jarring that you get the voice actors but not the music. It just feels incomplete. But as mixed a bag as the presentation is, what really matters here is the gameplay, because this is a multiplayer FPS that is only very loosely based on Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex. It basically just ends up using the source material for its aesthetics, and then for the actual gameplay, it ends up being a relatively generic hero shooter. You can select one of the members of Section 9 to play as, although they require you to get operator licenses to be able to actually use those characters, and you're only given 3 of them for free. The first of them when you start the game up to select your first operator, and the second 2 when you've leveled up after a bit, you'll get access to these operator licenses and be able to select 2 additional characters out of the around 8 or 9 of them that are currently in the game. And an operator license costs you a bit under 250,000 of the in-game currency, which you also use for buying equipment and buying attachments for your various weapons. You earn this currency at an extremely low rate while playing the game, and over time, when you've finally accrued enough to be able to buy something, you can go in and buy whatever it is you wanted to buy, only to find that the game is even more grindy than you thought. Because not only do you have to earn the currency to be able to buy the various things, you have to earn the TP, which is basically experience points in this game, to unlock the thing you want to buy. And you earn TP at an extremely slow rate. To give you a prime example, I selected the SCAR assault rifle to unlock as my first unlock, and it took me about 5 hours to unlock it. 5 hours of gameplay in order to unlock the ability to purchase! Not even just unlock it, no, the ability to purchase the SCAR. Same exact thing goes with the attachments that you can unlock for the various weapons. You have to earn them first with the TP, and then you have to be able to buy them with the in-game currency. It's really annoying, and it's something that just utterly drives me crazy about these free-to-play games. They always base their business model on how much you're willing to grind to be able to get the various things that you want to get. It's basically a business model built entirely around impatience. Now, the thing is that the starting weapons you get are actually surprisingly decent, especially if you get headshots, although good luck with actually getting a kill with the sniper rifles in this game, unless you unlock one of the ones that actually does a ridiculous amount of damage. But anyway, you're actually surprisingly competitive with the weapons you start with, as long as you get lucky with them, because one of the first things you notice in this thing, other than the simple fact that it's a grindy as hell, and that it drops you straight into the tutorial without letting you adjust your video settings, which I hate it when games do that, especially when they're like this game, and for some utterly baffling reason, they start in 1366 by 768 resolution and low graphics settings, and you're running both a pretty high-end gaming PC and a 1080p monitor. But I digress. The first thing you'll notice when you're actually trying to deal with the FPS mechanics is that the hit detection is unbelievably terrible. And by that I mean it makes the Battlefield 3 and 4 early alpha versions of the really terrible hit detection they had for a very, very long time look like masterpieces. And by that I mean it is not at all uncommon to be aiming for their legs or their feet and manage to somehow, someway get a headshot. Similarly, you could be aiming down your sights completely immobile, the enemy could be completely immobile, you could aim at their head and still miss. It is utterly baffling. And it's not like the weapons use actual projectiles either, they're all hit scans, so there's really no reason for it to behave like that. Which of course tells me that the netcode for the game is absolutely atrocious. And quite frankly, it overshadows everything else about the game. I mean, each operator has a special ability that they can activate, some of which can actually give your team bonuses as well if they sync up with you. And basically the point there is to hold off on using your special ability until you've accrued enough points to be able to get that tier 2 level of the ability and then be able to spread that out with your team. So then you get the bonuses and then everybody else who syncs up with you gets the bonuses as well, at least up to 4 people, including yourself actually. But that's overshadowed both by the atrocious netcode and the fact that all of the characters' abilities really don't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, it makes sense for Kusanagi to get active camo, but it doesn't really make sense for Bato to suddenly have a arm that turns into a rocket launcher, or for Togasa to drop seeker drones, but that's beside the point. The real point there is that their abilities don't really match their actual characters, and they really do feel like a cheap attempt at differentiating the characters simply for the sake of having a hero shooter that happens to have the Ghost in the Shell license. And when you actually get into the game modes themselves, you find an assortment of mostly pretty normal FPS modes. You have your basic team deathmatch, you have the demo mode, which is pretty much no different from Search and Destroy in other games out there, and then you have a sort of conquest mode where you capture points along the map, and then you move on to the next one, and it's kind of a back and forth because you can actually deploy Tachikomas during that. Those are think tanks, and they can basically sit there and absorb a ridiculous amount of damage unless you hack into them and make them vulnerable, and they can also just mow you down with machine gun fire. Although even with the Tachikomas, you have the issue of several of the maps being blatantly unbalanced toward one side or the other, where one side just has an advantageous starting position, and when they get to the middle of the map, they have it easier than the other team does. So you basically just better hope that you spawn on the right side of the map at that point, because if you don't, then you're pretty much screwed. And what you ultimately end up with is a fairly by-the-numbers FPS in this style, with some extremely mediocre weapon handling mechanics and a rather annoying unlock system, as well as downright atrocious netcode that ultimately completely ruins the experience, even if this wasn't just a cheap cash-in with the license. Which is exactly what this ends up being. It is just a blatantly cheap cash-in on the Ghost in the Shell license to make a free-to-play first-person shooter, because they seem to think that it can ride almost exclusively on its license, and it doesn't really matter how crappy the game actually is. Well, newsflash, you could kinda sorta get away with it if your core gameplay wasn't completely borked due to the terrible netcode. But since the terrible netcode is there and it screws up the actual game experience on top of all the other issues that it has, it's pretty much irredeemable at this point. Quite frankly, the only reason I even sunk 5 hours into it was to determine the amount of time it would take to actually unlock anything. And it turns out that's a ridiculously long time. I really can't recommend this game at all, not even if you're a die-hard Ghost in the Shell fan, because it just doesn't work. It's not a good game objectively, on top of the fact that it's a cheap cash-in. So at the absolute least, they need to fix the netcode before it would be even remotely worth trying out as a free-to-play game, let alone trying to invest more than simply a passing interest in. But even if they did manage to fix the netcode, you really can't get past the fact that the gameplay itself is just extremely mediocre at best. And as a result, it's really not even worth trying at all. Thanks for watching.